What would you do if you had everything? Money, luxury, fame, everything most people dream of, but you still felt empty inside. Isabel Montgomery, a billionaire heiress, had it all: private jets, designer clothes, and the world at her feet. But one day, she shocked everyone by making an unexpected decision to live without a single dollar for an entire year. Why would someone with everything walk away from it all? And what truth did she uncover that shook the world? Stay tuned, because what Isabel revealed about wealth, power, and life will make you rethink everything you know. Isabel Montgomery had lived her life in a world few could even dream of. Born into the wealthy Montgomery family, she never had to worry about money, status, or what others thought of her. Her family's empire spanned continents, and Isabel was set to inherit it all. From grand parties to exclusive vacations in private islands, her life was a series of luxury experiences that the average person would never know. But despite everything she had, Isabel felt a nagging emptiness. Her friends, most of whom were also part of elite social circles, seemed just as hollow as her. They valued appearances and status, not true connection. The world saw her as the perfect heiress, but inside she felt disconnected and lost. Her family, especially her father Charles Montgomery, a powerful businessman who had built the empire from the ground up, urged her to embrace her role. "This life is your birthright, Isabel," he'd say. "Don't throw it all away." Her childhood friend Naomi, who had grown up in a far different world, often reminded Isabel of what truly mattered. Naomi had worked hard for everything she had, starting from humble beginnings. Their differences only seemed to deepen Isabel's internal struggle. Naomi worked at a non-profit organization focused on community support and social justice. Her life, though far less glamorous, had a clarity that Isabel envied. It wasn't until Isabel's 25th birthday, surrounded by glittering guests at a lavish party, that everything clicked. She stood alone on the balcony, watching as the world moved around her in a blur of noise and celebration. The wealth, the glamour, none of it mattered. She felt like a puppet in a world of strings, controlled by the expectations placed on her, unable to move or live for herself. That night, Isabel made a decision that would change everything. She would step away from her inherited life of luxury and spend a year living as an average person. No wealth, no status, no comfort. She would experience life as most people did. For the first time in her life, she didn't want to be defined by her family's money. She wanted to find her own identity, her own purpose. The news of Isabel's decision was met with shock. Her family was furious, her friends were bewildered, and the media saw it as a sensational story. But Isabel, driven by an intense desire for self-discovery, packed her things and set off to start her journey in a small, modest apartment in Brooklyn. Her first days were full of uncertainty. She had no job, no support, and no idea how to navigate the real world. But she was determined. She was about to learn just how difficult and transformative it would be to live without money. In these first days of her new life, Isabel discovered the harsh reality of living without her privilege. She struggled with basic tasks, grocery shopping, budgeting, and finding work. She quickly learned how little she had prepared for the realities of a world without wealth. Despite the challenges, there was an undeniable sense of freedom in the simplicity. For the first time, she wasn't defined by her family's expectations or the wealth she had been born into. This was her chance to discover who she truly was. As she navigated this new world, Isabel met a range of characters, from struggling single mothers to workers trying to make ends meet. Each person had a story, a struggle, a reason for their resilience. Isabel began to understand the power of human connection, something she had never truly experienced in her luxurious life. It was through these encounters that she would come to realize the most profound truths of all. As Isabel's life of luxury began to feel like a distant memory, the challenges she faced in her new world intensified. She had no idea what it meant to truly survive on her own. With her family's money completely out of the picture, Isabel had to learn everything from scratch. Simple tasks that had once seemed trivial now became overwhelming. Grocery shopping, budgeting, and even cooking her own meals were tasks she had never had to worry about. The apartment she had rented, though modest, was a far cry from her previous penthouse suite. It was small, cramped, and lacked the conveniences she was used to. At first, Isabel was buoyed by a sense of optimism. She saw this year as an opportunity for self-discovery, a chance to build her life from the ground up. But the harsh reality soon set in. She was constantly reminded of the wealth she had once taken for granted. The cafe where she went to buy her morning coffee seemed overpriced compared to the private baristas she used to have at her disposal. She no longer had the luxury of spontaneous shopping sprees, and for the first time, she had to carefully plan every purchase she made. Her first big hurdle came when she tried to find a job. Isabel had no qualifications outside of being an heiress, and most employers dismissed her applications without a second thought. When she finally landed an interview at a local cafe, she was shocked by the hostility in the atmosphere. The manager, an older man named Frank, looked her up and down, clearly unimpressed by her expensive attire. "I'm not sure you're cut out for this, Miss Montgomery," Frank said bluntly after hearing about her background. "It's hard work here. It's not all parties and champagne, you know." Isabel's face flushed, her pride stung by his words. She had never been judged based on her abilities. She had always been seen as a walking checkbook, her value based on her last name. But now, for the first time, she felt like an outsider, someone who had no real place in the world. Nonetheless, Isabel was determined to prove herself. She began her shift at the cafe the following week, donning an apron and serving customers. The work was grueling. Long hours, constant motion, and little appreciation. She washed dishes, took orders, and learned how to brew coffee, all while dealing with impatient customers who had no idea who she was. There were moments of frustration, of wanting to walk out and return to her old life, but she fought through it. Slowly but surely, she began to build her confidence. However, things took a darker turn when she encountered one of the regulars at the cafe, Greg, a wealthy businessman who frequented the establishment. Greg was charming at first, but Isabel quickly began to notice his condescending attitude. He would often compliment her appearance, but in a way that made her feel small. "You're really quite beautiful, Miss Montgomery," he would say. "Too bad you're not more suited to your family's line of work. You'd make a great wife for a man like me." Isabel felt a mixture of anger and helplessness. She was used to being admired for her looks, but never like this. Greg seemed to think that her life had no real value outside of being someone's trophy wife. His remarks grew more frequent and invasive, and Isabel began to dread his visits. Every time he sat at her section, she had to fight to keep her composure. One afternoon, Greg crossed a line that Isabel hadn't anticipated. As she walked by his table, he grabbed her wrist, pulling her close. "You can't hide behind that apron forever, sweetheart," he whispered in a voice only she could hear. "You're too beautiful for this kind of life. Come with me and I'll make sure you never have to work again." Isabel yanked her wrist free, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the eyes of the other customers on her, their whispers carrying in the air. "Let go of me," she said through gritted teeth. The calmness in her voice was a stark contrast to the chaos swirling inside her. Greg smirked, clearly amused by her resistance. "You'll come around eventually. They all do." The encounter left Isabel shaken. For the first time, she truly understood what it felt like to be objectified, reduced to nothing more than a physical presence. She realized that no amount of money could protect her from the cruelty that came with being a woman in a world ruled by power and status. That night, Isabel sat alone in her small apartment, contemplating what had happened. She had been so focused on proving herself that she had failed to see the deeper issues at play. Greg's words stung, but it was more than that. He represented everything she had come to despise. He saw her as a possession, just like her family had always seen her. She was a pawn in a world that didn't care about her humanity. In that moment, Isabel made a vow to herself. She would no longer allow herself to be controlled by the expectations of others. She would stand up for herself, not just in her job, but in every aspect of her life. Her year without money had forced her to confront her fears and insecurities, but now it was time to confront the system that had kept her chained to an identity she no longer wanted. The following weeks were a blur of challenges. Isabel faced more criticism and mockery than she had ever experienced. Her co-workers at the cafe, who had initially seen her as an outsider, began to treat her with suspicion. They didn't understand why she had chosen this life, and many saw her as a curiosity rather than a peer. Some even made cruel jokes behind her back, insinuating that she was playing a role, that she was pretending to be one of them. But there was one person who began to see Isabel in a new light: Naomi. Naomi had been watching from the sidelines, quietly supportive, but unsure of how Isabel would fare in her new life. She knew how hard it was to make it without money, without privilege, but she also knew that Isabel had the strength to survive. One day, as Isabel was wiping down tables after a busy lunch rush, Naomi walked into the cafe. She greeted Isabel with a warm smile and sat down at a corner table. Isabel could feel her eyes on her as she moved through the cafe, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of calm. Naomi's presence was a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. As the day went on, Isabel made her way over to Naomi's table. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "The people here, they don't get it." Naomi looked up at her, her expression filled with understanding. "I know it's hard, but you're doing something most people wouldn't even think to try. You're finding out who you are without all the distractions of wealth." Isabel nodded, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. Naomi had always been there for her, even when Isabel hadn't fully understood what she was going through. But now, Isabel saw her as a beacon of truth in a world full of illusions. And that was when she realized the most important lesson of all. She didn't need to live for anyone else's approval. It wasn't about impressing her family, her friends, or even the people she worked with. It was about finding her own voice, her own identity. In Naomi's eyes, Isabel saw a reflection of the woman she could become: strong, independent, and free. Isabel's journey was far from over, but with Naomi's support and her growing sense of self-worth, she felt ready to face whatever came next. She was no longer the sheltered heiress hiding behind her family's wealth. Isabel Montgomery had become something much more powerful, a woman who knew her worth and was willing to fight for it. But the world, it seemed, was not ready for her transformation. The next phase of Isabel's journey would force her to confront the harshest truths of all, and the twists that lay ahead would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself. Isabel's year without money was reaching its breaking point. She had faced the brutal reality of life without privilege, and it was beginning to take its toll. As the days dragged on, she struggled with her identity more than ever. She had experienced moments of clarity where she truly understood the value of hard work and human connection. But now, as the year neared its conclusion, the weight of her decision felt unbearable. She was constantly scrutinized, judged, and misunderstood. It felt like the world was watching her, waiting for her to fail. One evening, after another long shift at the cafe, Isabel found herself sitting at the small table in her cramped apartment. The apartment, once a symbol of her departure from her previous life, now felt like a prison. It was too small, too cold, and far too isolating. Isabel ran her fingers through her hair, exhausted and defeated. She had been pushing herself too hard. She had come so far, and yet she felt like a failure. Her phone buzzed across the table. She looked down to see a message from her father, Charles Montgomery. The text was simple, yet it hit Isabel like a hammer. "I need to speak to you. There's a business opportunity that can't wait. Come home, Isabel." Isabel stared at the screen, her heart sinking. She knew what her father was asking. He wanted her back in the family business, to take her rightful place as the heir to the Montgomery empire. The wealth, the status, the power. Everything she had walked away from just a year ago. The message was an invitation to return to the life she had rejected, the life she had fought so hard to escape. Torn between the life she had built for herself and the life her family expected her to return to, Isabel felt trapped. She didn't want to go back. She had found peace, even if it had been hard-earned. But the pressure, the allure of everything she had once known, weighed heavily on her. The next morning, Isabel stood in front of the cafe, staring up at the building that had been both a battleground and a sanctuary. She had received an invitation to an exclusive event, a gala hosted by her father's company. It was a lavish affair, the kind of event she would have once attended without a second thought. But now, the thought of stepping back into that world filled her with dread. As she walked into the gala, every part of her felt out of place. The grand hall shimmered with chandeliers, the laughter of the elite echoing in every corner. There were politicians, celebrities, and business tycoons, people who didn't care about her struggles, only her family's wealth. Isabel's every movement was scrutinized by the eyes of those who had once adored her, but now looked at her as a curiosity, a distant figure from a bygone era. Her father spotted her from across the room, his face lighting up in surprise. He rushed over, his hand outstretched. "Isabel," he said, his voice warm but edged with something else. "I knew you'd come around. It's time for you to rejoin the family. We need you, now more than ever." For a moment, Isabel wanted to let the embrace happen. She wanted to fall back into the life she had known, the life of comfort and certainty. But something inside her snapped. She pulled back, her eyes flashing with an intensity that caught her father off guard. "No, Father, I'm not coming back," she said, her voice steady but filled with a strength that surprised even her. Charles Montgomery's face darkened. "You don't understand, Isabel. This is bigger than you. The company, the legacy, it's all waiting for you. Your future is here." Isabel stood her ground. "My future is mine to decide. I don't need your money or your legacy to define me." The words hit harder than Isabel had expected. She had always been the dutiful daughter, the one who had done everything in her power to live up to her family's expectations. But in that moment, she realized something. She wasn't her family's legacy. She wasn't their puppet. She was her own person, with her own dreams, desires, and purpose. As Isabel turned to walk away, a figure from the crowd stepped forward. Greg, the man who had made her life at the cafe so uncomfortable, the man who had objectified her and reduced her to a mere object. He had been watching from the sidelines, and now he moved in for the kill. "Isabel, come on. Don't pretend you're better than this," he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You can't escape what you are. You belong here, with people who understand how the world really works." Isabel's stomach turned. Greg's words echoed the very things she had spent the last year trying to escape. The idea that she was nothing without money, that she had no worth beyond her appearance and family name. She had spent months proving to herself that she was more than that. And now, as the confrontation reached its peak, she knew exactly what she had to do. She faced Greg, her eyes blazing with determination. "No," she said, her voice strong. "I don't belong here. I belong in a world where people are valued for who they are, not what they have. You can't buy respect, Greg, and you'll never have mine." The words hung in the air like a challenge. For a moment, the room fell silent. Greg opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had no response to Isabel's newfound strength. The entire room had been watching the exchange, and it was clear that Isabel had made an impact. Her words had hit home, not just for Greg, but for everyone in the room who had been living in a world built on materialism and status. Isabel had exposed the truth in a way that no one else could. But just as the tension seemed to subside, Isabel's father intervened. "Enough, Isabel. This childish rebellion is over. You're coming home with me, and you're going to take your place in the company." Isabel's heart pounded as she stood in front of her father. The last thread of her old life was pulling at her, trying to drag her back into the world of privilege and power. But something inside her had changed. She had experienced life as a person, not an heir. She had found value in things that money could never buy: love, authenticity, and connection. "No," Isabel said again, more firmly this time. "I'm not going back to that life. I've found who I truly am, and I won't let you or anyone else take that from me." Her father's face twisted with anger, but Isabel didn't flinch. In that moment, she knew that walking away from her family's empire was the hardest decision she would ever make, but it was also the most empowering one. Isabel turned to leave the gala, not as the heiress to a fortune, but as the woman she had fought so hard to become. And just as she reached the door, she heard a voice behind her. "Isabel." It was Naomi. "I'm proud of you." Isabel smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. Naomi had been there for her all along, and now she was the only person who truly understood what Isabel had just done. Isabel had chosen a path of her own, a path that would lead her to something more meaningful than wealth or status. As she stepped out into the cool night air, Isabel felt a sense of freedom like never before. The world had tried to define her, but she had rewritten her own story. The truth was, she didn't need money to live a fulfilling life. All she needed was the courage to be herself, and that courage would carry her forward into a future filled with possibilities. As the months passed since that defining moment at the gala, Isabel's life began to transform in ways she had never imagined. She had stepped away from the expectations of her family and her privileged life. But what followed was a new kind of success, one rooted in authenticity and purpose. The truth she had exposed about herself, her family, and the world of wealth and privilege had reverberated through the lives of those who witnessed it. Isabel was no longer just the heiress to the Montgomery fortune. She had become a symbol of self-determination, showing others that true wealth comes from within. In the weeks following her departure from the family business, Isabel focused on creating a life that felt true to her. She used the platform her family had once provided to champion causes she cared about, issues like education, social justice, and income equality. She didn't do it with the same glossy, polished image of a billionaire heiress. Instead, she used her voice to reach people who needed to hear the truth. Isabel shared her journey, her struggles, and the lessons she had learned, and in doing so, she inspired others who felt trapped in their own lives, unsure of how to break free. Her relationship with Naomi deepened. Naomi, who had always been a steady force in Isabel's life, became not just a friend, but a mentor. Naomi taught Isabel the power of humility and compassion, lessons that Isabel had never fully understood in her wealthy upbringing. Together, they worked on community projects, with Isabel offering her time and resources to help those in need, something she had never done in her previous life. Her sense of purpose grew stronger, and the life she had longed for was finally beginning to take shape. Isabel's family, particularly her father, tried to sway her back into the fold of the Montgomery Empire. There were offers, business opportunities, and even pleas for reconciliation. But Isabel remained firm. She had faced the world without the shield of wealth and privilege, and in doing so had discovered who she truly was. She no longer needed her family's empire to feel secure. She had built something far more valuable, the trust of the people around her and the self-respect she had fought for. Over time, the media began to shift their perception of Isabel. No longer was she just the rebellious daughter of a billionaire. She had become a thought leader, an advocate for change, and a true philanthropist. The message she shared was simple yet profound. Wealth and status don't define who you are. Your character, your actions, and your values do. Isabel's story was a testament to the power of choosing your own path, regardless of where you come from. As she stood on the steps of a community center, surrounded by people who had once been strangers, Isabel felt an overwhelming sense of peace. This was the life she had chosen, not the one dictated to her by her family or society. The crowd cheered for her work, for her voice, but Isabel knew that the real victory was not the applause. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had made a difference, not just in the world, but in her own life. The moral of Isabel's journey was clear. The pursuit of happiness, fulfillment, and purpose cannot be bought. It must be earned through hard work, sacrifice, and authenticity. Isabel's year without money had been a lesson in self-worth and personal growth. She had learned that true wealth lies in the impact you have on the world and the people you touch, not in the number of zeros on a paycheck or the size of a bank account. As she looked out over the crowd, Isabel finally understood the real meaning of freedom. It wasn't about walking away from wealth. It was about walking towards something far more valuable, a life defined by choice, by purpose, and by the courage to be true to yourself. And with that understanding, Isabel knew that the best was yet to come.